Welcome to Meanwhile at the Museum, America's #1 Cincinnati-based museum podcast that takes you behind the scenes and beyond Cincinnati Museum Center. Over there on the ones and twos, we have our producer, Magic Mitch.
Hey.
I'm Cody Hefner, and today we are joined by Dave Duszynski, the Silver Fox, Cincinnati Museum Center's Vice President of Featured Experiences. Is that still what you're going by?
I guess so. I've had a lot of titles over the year, but yeah, that's the current one, I believe.
Duszynski is spelled exactly how it sounds, which is what I always tell people. Anytime you're doing a media interview and people say, all right, give us the name, give us the title, and I always say Duszynski. It's spelled how it sounds. And they always look at me. I've got it down now. Is Duszynski Polish? Is that a Polish name?
It is Polish, yes. Yeah. The correct pronunciation is Duszynski. Sometimes people will say that, and I just don't correct them because it's absolutely right. But the family has just always said Duszynski.
Did you grow up in a heavily Polish area?
No.
You're a Michigan boy, born and raised,
grew up
right?
in Detroit area. Yeah, my father was born in Michigan City, Indiana, which was a major area for Polish immigration. But at some point he moved to the Detroit area, or his father moved to the Detroit area. But we were not in the major Polish suburb of Detroit, but there's still a lot of Polish people in Detroit.
Because there's that strip, sort of Cleveland, Toledo, all the way over to Chicago, right? All around the Great Lakes.
Yep.
Mitch, you're from Toledo.
I am from Toledo.
Are you Polish at all?
I am not Polish. I'm mostly German.
That makes sense to me.
But Toledo has a lot of Polish heritage.
I learned that because when I was in grad school, I was going to write my thesis on these foreign generals in the American Revolution, which was not a story at all. My professor let me work on it for 3 months before I told him there's nothing here to write on. He goes, yeah, I know. But, there were a lot of Polish officers who came over, and a lot of the Polish archives were in Chicago. That's when I learned that. And I also learned, the C's and S's and Z's all together and how to pronounce those.
Yep.
So if my college training did me anything, it prepared me for how to pronounce your name, Dave.
That's good to know.
Okay, so going back to young Dave
thanks,
in
Mitch.
Michigan. As a kid, what were your interests? Like, was there something as a child that started you on the path to where you are today?
Absolutely. It goes all the way back to elementary school, believe it or not. Probably somewhere around 4th grade, I had a friend. His name was Rusty. He lived within walking distance of my house, but not by today's standards. But it took me 20 minutes to get to his house. But I'd walk to his house, and he had a telescope. And once in a while, we'd stay overnight at each other's house. And when we stayed overnight at his house, he would take his telescope out, and we'd look at things in the sky. And that really was sort of the genesis for my background in astronomy. And eventually I got a telescope, and then I got another telescope. And even when I was in high school, I was still very nerdy. And my parents, I don't think ever knew, but at night when I was supposed to be in bed, I would take the screens off the windows in my bedroom and stick my telescope out the window and get good views of things, even though I had a very limited segment of the sky that I could see from our house. And I had a book that I would record observations. I just found that a couple of years ago when I was cleaning out some things in my parents' house, the old book where I recorded daily sunspot activity on the sun and very nerdy kind of stuff all the way back into junior high and high school. That's kind of started me on the path of astronomy. But when I went to college, I was not thinking astronomy at all. I was enrolled in a pre-med program, not thinking I would ever be a doctor, but I didn't know where else to enroll, so I had to declare something. Yeah,
we're so close. You were pre-med?
Yeah, I was pre-med for a year.
Why?
Well, it's because I went to Michigan State, and Michigan State has these residential colleges, and the one I enrolled in was Lyman Briggs. And the advantage of these residential colleges is there was a lot of the classes that were in your dorm, and you could take it with other like-minded people. So I knew I was going to be somewhere in the science field. I've kind of felt that, and this was a place, a residential college within the university, where a lot of science people started. because all the math classes were taught in your building, and they were different math classes than the ones that were taught to the general university, going all the way up into calculus and beyond. Anyway, that's where I started, but I didn't know what I was going to do. In fact, I changed my major first to geology, thinking I was going to go into geology. And then I decided I had to take electives, right? Everybody has to take electives.
Yeah.
And I said, ugh, this should be an easy elective, astronomy. So I took an astronomy class just because it would be easy and I wouldn't have to spend a lot of time on it. And then I took another astronomy class, and then I took another astronomy class. And then one of the astronomy professors asked me if I wanted to work at the observatory, which was like 5 miles off campus, and I had to ride my bike 5 miles, winter or summer, out to the observatory.
Uphill both ways, right?
Yeah. Well, thank goodness it was flat. But I worked out there for 3 or 4 years while I was there. And then I worked in the planetarium there, and it just kind of grew. It just never got out of my system, the whole astronomy thing.
You thought the astronomy classes were going to be easy. Did you find them to be easy?
The first ones were. Then it got into the theoretical astronomy stuff, and that sort of was not my expertise.
Yeah.
I don't mind working with formulas, but I want to put real numbers in formulas and get real answers out of it. And the theoretical classes were all, variables. It's all about putting variables in formulas and getting an answer, which is a series of variables. And that wasn't me. So I was always sort of the bottom of the rung for those classes. But then there was other classes that were like spherical trigonometry, which all the other people that were theoretical people just like struggled in, and I like aced that one class ahead of everybody else. Everybody was looking at me like, Dave, you're never at the top of the list. But that would give you real numbers of things, outputs. So anyway.
I had to take a history theory class or something like that. One of the papers we had to write, I remember we all shared an office. So you would kind of walk as a herd together to the class, and then you'd walk as a herd together back to the office. And we all sat there and said, does anyone know what we're supposed to write about? And everyone's like, nope, not at all. And it was so hard because it's like, don't actually do the work. Talk about and think about how to do the work. And for me, that just drove me crazy.
Yeah.
But the college class that really killed me, I started pre-med too. When you ask an 18-year-old to just say, here you go chart your future, go pick a major, you're usually thinking of something fun or something your parents kind of force you into or talk you into. And that's when I learned I like science like from a distance. I like science once it's been done and people can tell me about the science. I didn't like the act of having to figure out the science, so I switched to history real fast.
Yeah.
So you grew up in a suburb of Detroit.
Right.
Did you have city lights to contend with
yes.
your telescope?
Yeah, not nearly as bad as it is now where I lived, but it was dark enough that I could even see the aurora borealis out my bedroom window.
Really?
So it's not nearly as bad as it is today. But of course, things like the sun, the moon, the planets, those shine through any light pollution. So I was able to look at all of those things with my telescope.
At certain points, can you see every planet?
No, you can see Uranus for sure. Neptune is a real challenge. But if you're in a place like New Mexico, I think on borderline situations when Neptune is in opposition, you can probably see it if you know exactly where to look. But it would be very faint and very, very borderline. Pluto never. I still consider Pluto a planet.
Do you?
Yeah. I was brought up that way. I don't know.
Well, that's how we learned the solar system. My very excellent mother just served us 9 pizzas. And without Pluto, it all falls apart.
Yeah, I know.
Why did Pluto get demoted? This is my favorite part of the podcast where we have people on who are experts in certain areas, and I just get to ask them my questions.
It's all based on science. I guess it's been determined that Pluto didn't form in the same way that the other planets formed out of the original material that formed the sun and the solar system. It appears to have formed in a different way, maybe captured later on gravitationally by the solar system. It's in a very unusual orbit. It takes 247 years to go around the sun, and during a few of those years, it's actually closer to the sun than Neptune, so that's how unusual the orbit is. So it was determined that it didn't form in the same way, and because of its size and how it probably came to be captivated by the sun's gravity, then they just decided to demote it into a minor planet.
There's been speculation that there could be more planets or objects beyond Pluto. Is
Absolutely.
it possible that some of those would be classified planets, even
Yes.
though Pluto's not?
Yeah, they could be. In fact, I did a planetarium show called The Missing Planet way back when I became the planetarium director at the Old Museum of Natural History that went specifically into the search for a 10th planet at the time. Now I guess it would be the 9th planet again. But there's still people, astronomers that are out there searching, believing that there is another significant body out there that we just haven't discovered yet, too far away. But they are seeing some gravitational tugs on Pluto and Neptune that seem to indicate that there is something else out there. It'd just be very difficult to see because it's so far away.
The solar system, the orbits of the planets, and you mentioned that Pluto goes inside Neptune's orbit. When you see them represented in textbooks and stuff, it's all flat. You know, all the orbits are flat, which would indicate that there's a chance Pluto and Neptune could collide. Or all the planets kind of on different planes?
That's the other thing about Pluto's orbit is most of the planets up through Neptune are in a fairly similar plane, very close. But Pluto is tilted, I can't remember the angle, but Pluto's orbital is tilted relative to the average plane of all the other planets fairly significantly. So it's not really on a collision path. There's no point in the future where the two paths would actually hit each other.
Everyone listening is getting a snapshot of these kind of every month or every couple months we get the longest email Dave has ever sent. Dave doesn't send long emails unless it's astronomy related. And then he sends very detailed emails, which has gotten me to wake up in the middle of the night and wrap myself in a blanket and go outside and just stare up at the sky for this meteor shower or that meteor shower. All right, so you were at the planetarium in Michigan State. You were running that, and then
As a senior, I had a critical decision to make. I was bound to be in the astronomy world one way or another, and I had experienced the two sort of paths that astronomers can take. I had a degree in astrophysics, but I had two paths that I had to choose between. One is to become a sort of astrophysicist.
You have a degree in astrophysics?
Yeah.
Did you know this?
Maybe?
So you have a degree in astronomy and astrophysics?
Well, astrophysics is the degree. So when you take astronomy classes up to the maximum number of astronomy classes that exist, your degree is in astrophysics. If you take the physics to go with it. If you take the same amount of physics classes and math classes, then you get an astrophysics degree.
How many classes or credits short are you of being an astronaut? Did you ever think about being an astronaut?
I never did think about that
Really?
seriously. Yeah, I don't know. I just didn't think it was like within the realm of possibility, I guess. So I never thought about it.
All right, so
my choice was to become an astrophysicist that would work at an observatory all night and sleep during the day. This is the way my brain was computing it.
a bat, sure.
Yeah, or I could go to the educational side because I had worked in the planetarium at Michigan State for 3 years also, given school classes, written some planetarium shows, did a lot of astronomy education. So I chose the astronomy education path. And then I took a master's program in communication and astronomy education, actually, which was a unique thing that they had at Michigan State. So then I got my master's there also. Then I went out to an internship in Rochester, New York at what was the Strassenberg Planetarium, which in the mid-'70s was the epitome place to work in a planetarium in the world. And I learned all about show production because if you work in a planetarium, it's not just about knowing astronomy. It's about how do you create shows for the dome environment. So I was there for 2 years. When I left there, I got a job at Eastern Kentucky University, and that's what brought me to this region of the world. And at Eastern Kentucky University, they had just purchased a planetarium system, which was the state-of-the-art in the world. It was going to be one of the second or third automated planetarium that was digitally controlled. It wasn't digital projection like they have now, but everything was digitally controlled, manipulated by a computer, as opposed to earlier planetariums where things were geared and analog just to get the moon and the sun and the planets in the right place in the artificial sky. This planetarium, everything was controlled by a computer. And it didn't work initially. So I was there for a total of 5 years, and the university never accepted the equipment from the company because it wasn't working correctly. And finally, a new president came in and said, why are we paying these specialized people? We had a staff of like 5 people, a musician, an artist. I was the writer, an astronomer, and then there was the planetarium director, and then the IT guy who was controlling everything. So we had this whole specialized team, one of the best planetarium teams in the country at the time. And the president came in and said, this is crazy. We haven't accepted the equipment. We need to lay everybody off.
So in those 5 years, when you hadn't accepted the equipment, were you still doing like old school shows, or were you just sitting around like? So you just had a bunch of ideas ready to go.
I did. I'd written the first script for the first show, and of course it never got done. But my career took sort of a different, sort of little tributary off path at that point in time, since I had time to spare. And the science department, they taught astronomy classes at Eastern Kentucky University. They didn't have a degree in it, but they taught introductory astronomy classes, and I was asked if I wanted to teach astronomy classes, and I said sure. So I started teaching like 2 astronomy classes every semester, and I was in charge of the astronomy lab. I was in charge of building an outdoor platform where kids could come, and we bought 12 telescopes and then come and do astronomy labs at night. So that was kind of between that and golf. Those were my 2 things that I did for 5 years. Yeah. And wrote a radio program. The other thing I got into is the NPR station at EKU asked me whether they should subscribe to this radio show, which was coming out of the University of Texas, about astronomy every night. And I said, we don't want to do that. I'll do it. I got nothing else to do. So I started this astronomy radio show for 5 nights a week. It was a 5-minute script. I didn't read it. They had a professional voice that read it, and it was called Skydate, and it was broadcast to about 2/3 of the state of Kentucky for 13 years. So I continued to do this after I left there, and probably for the first 10 years that I was working here at Museum Center, I was still writing the script.
For 13 years?
Yeah, I wrote it for 13 years.
Every
day, a script every day.
A script a day?
Wow.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, I would do it in chunks. I'd do 2 weeks in advance and send it off, and they would record it and then play it on the right day.
Why do you make me write the press releases for exhibits and films and stuff? Shouldn't you do that?
Well,
that's embarrassing
I guess
now.
he did his time.
I guess.
Yeah, so that's what I did when I had 5 years of
you were essentially
not my real work. Yeah.
a race car driver, and they hadn't delivered the car yet, so you didn't have anything to do.
That's right. So then when they laid me off, I heard about an opening of the planetarium here at the museum, at the old museum on Gilbert Avenue. And they hired me in 1985 as a contract employee to write a show about Halley's Comet, because Halley's Comet was due later that year.
How often does that come around?
76 years.
Okay,
Yeah.
So what we have, how many more to go?
Looks like it's due back around in 2061.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So anyway,
Have you seen Halley's Comet? Can you see it with the naked eye?
Yes.
Okay.
We saw it in 85 and late 85, early 86. In fact, the museum, we had a special event where we told people, you want to see Halley's Comet? We'll take you out and show you Halley's Comet. We're not going to tell you where we're going to go. You sign up for the program. We're going to carpool out, a car caravan out in the middle of the night. And we did that, and we went down to a park about halfway between here and Lexington, and fairly dark sky location, and at a park next to a golf course, and saw Halley's Comet.
That's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
People were so trusting back then.
I know.
They would still do it today, for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, I heard about the job here at the museum and took the job, wrote the program. They asked me to stay and write another program. They asked me to stay and write another program. So I worked at the planetarium there for 5 years. And all the while, the museum was planning to move to Union Terminal,
Right.
which I had very little knowledge of. I was in my own little world producing planetarium shows. And DeVere Burt, the director at the time, came to me and said, Dave, I'd like for you to switch your career path and go run this OMNIMAX theater thing we're creating over at the new building, Union Terminal. And I said, I don't want to do that.
Anyone who knows Dave, that's such a shocking answer in retrospect.
Yeah. So it's like my whole life has been astronomy, and I don't think I want to do that. And DeVere said, okay, I'll make you a deal. We're 6 months away from opening. We're way late on hiring a director for the theater. If you'll just go and run it, you get it started, open the theater, run it for a year, we'll find somebody to take over and you can go back and go into the planetarium. So I agreed to do that. He gave me a deal I couldn't refuse. And so I agreed to do that. And a lot of my colleagues around the country had done similar things because that was a time period when these OMNIMAX theaters were being built in multiple museums, and some of them were flat-screen IMAX theaters. And in almost every case, the planetarium director was the person that was pulled away to run the other theater because we knew how to operate theaters, and
Theaters and domes,
right,
domes
and automation
right?
systems.
Yeah.
I mean, the planetarium world at that time was incredibly sophisticated as far as how they used computers to control like 100 individual special effects. And we created a planetarium show at the Cincinnati Planetarium at the old Gilbert Avenue location. We would have a 40-minute show that would have 100 special effects that were individually controlled by a computer. And the music track was controlled, and we would go out and hire a musician to choreograph the music, and we hired an artist who would create the artwork for the special effects and for the panorama projector. It was really quite a sophisticated thing. So planetarium directors really had a lot of sort of technical knowledge about how to run a theater and control systems within theaters.
Because you were essentially running your own film production company, top to bottom, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in a very odd way, but yes.
So an OMNIMAX theater, for anyone who hasn't seen it, ours is 72 feet in diameter.
Yes.
It is basically a half dome. And the film is in front of you, above you, and on both sides of you. The film surrounds you. You feel immersed in it, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it's almost a full dome, actually, but the image is projected on about 2/3 of the dome, if you actually look at it. But it's enough to really make you feel like you're in the middle of the action.
Ours opened in 1990. Where were we at on that spectrum? Had many opened before ours? Were we kind of one of the first?
That's a question that I could have answered 30 years ago. But as I recall, the number 13 sticks in my head. I think we're probably the 13th dome theater to be built. But there were a lot of museums had sort of the flat screen versions also. But the domes was sort of they were more expensive to build, but they were considered to be more unique because they were very different than, conventional cinema, for example.
And even now, the closest one's probably 6 hours from
St.
Cincinnati.
Louis.
Yeah.
Yeah. St. Louis, Detroit. Detroit has one also, so that's a little closer. Yeah.
Now, you not only ran the OMNIMAX Theater, which you continue to do.
Yeah.
But you have an IMDb.
So obviously I didn't go back to the planetarium.
Right. DeVere duped you on that one.
Yeah, once I discovered what this was all about, it was sort of opening sort of new eyes for me. It's like for 17 years I was working only in the astronomy field, and all of a sudden now it was exciting to have to learn about all these other science topics that we were doing because we got involved in film production and in promotion. Even in the promotion or marketing of films, you learned a lot about the subject matter of the films, whether they were volcanoes or underwater films or whatever.
Do you remember the first film that opened?
Oh, yeah. Blue Planet. Yeah, which was an astronomy film. It was about the astronauts looking back at the Earth and marveling at our blue planet and how it looked from space and how the boundaries disappeared. And it's just a sort of a religious experience for astronauts, for the early astronauts.
How did you feel when you saw that? When you first saw something on the OMNIMAX screen, how did you feel?
amazed. I mean, it really was at the time, and still is, a very unique experience. But seeing the Earth as filmed by these special IMAX cameras from the space shuttle, I mean, those were spectacular images that people just hadn't seen at the time. So that was really an eye-opening situation.
Because if we haven't mentioned it, this would have been in 1990.
Yes.
And I think if you're thinking of films around that time period, and Mitch, you can check me off on this. One of the big ones, and when people think of a film that jumps out to them is like Jurassic Park, and it was probably 1993. But you're talking about films that show you something you've never seen before. I mean, this is 1990, so just go back and look at the films that are out. And Blue Planet it still holds up.
Absolutely,
right? There's
yeah.
still theater. It'll still show in rotation in theaters today at different
it could
museums.
if it had been digitized, but now that we're in the digital world, this film was made with analog film, and some analog films have been converted to digital, but this one has not. So it would hold up, absolutely, but it's not available for us to show it anymore. Now that we've converted to digital.
Do you know how many films you've shown in the OMNIMAX theater here?
95.
95?
95.
All right, so five to go to get to 100, right?
Yeah.
So coming up shortly after this episode comes out, so probably around the time you're hearing this, we will potentially have film 96.
Yep. And 97.
And 97 close behind it. So there's potential by the end of 2025 we could hit or be close to 100.
I think we will hit it, yeah.
Do you have a favorite of those?
You know, people obviously ask me that question.
You've probably forgotten more than you've
than
you've remembered of them.
At one point in time, I could recite the films in order. Now I look at a list and say, I don't remember even doing that film. But it's really difficult. And there's different reasons why some films are my favorites. For example, I've been an executive producer on some films, so those are sort of favorites because I've been deeply involved in those films.
How many?
I really don't know the number of films that I've been executive producer on.
I don't think your IMDb page is up to date
It's
because I looked at it before we recorded.
We should get it up to date.
And how do we do that?
I don't even know how
It's
the
editable
information
anyway.
on there that's on there got on there, because I don't submit anything. I don't know where they figure this stuff out, but I think they were paying more attention in the early years, in the early IMAX years, about maybe getting some of those films on there. But now there's so many IMAX films; they're definitely all not on IMDb. But anyway, one of my favorites, the first one I worked on significantly, was called Search for the Great Sharks. And that was a 1995 film. And Gilbert, who got me into this whole thing, he decided that not only was Cincinnati Museum Center going to be in the theater pantheon, it was also going to be a producer of films. We were going to take an active role in creating films. And the first film that we did that with was Search for the Great Sharks. So in the modern digital world, as you create a film, you can look at rough cuts sent to your computer, and you can look at them on a computer screen. But back in 1990, 95, no, everything was done with film, and this is a very unique film. So they would downprint it to 35 millimeter, edit it together manually, and then you would gather all the key producers together into a room, usually in LA, and look at the current version, make comments about it, say this is what we got to change about it, and then everybody would go home and the producers would work to re-edit it, and then you'd go back to LA. So for Search for the Great Sharks, I probably went to LA 5-6 times looking at different versions of the film, and then it came out. And that film still holds the record for the most people that ever saw a film here in our theater.
Really?
Yeah,
It still has the attendance record?
Yeah, around 300,000, which
Wow.
is just a crazy number. And
Who narrated it?
I honestly don't remember. I can't remember if there was back in those days, they didn't use movie
Like
star
celebrity. Yeah, because
peoples.
now
Yeah.
every film, Ryan Reynolds, that's
We had
all.
Bryan Cranston recently.
Bryan Cranston, Leonardo DiCaprio.
Sam
Yeah.
Neill voices T-Rex.
Yeah, so it's sometimes the way they're marketed, the narrator is as important as the title or
Yeah.
the subject of the film, and sometimes it can Like it can really make it. Morgan Freeman narrated one, and
He's done a bunch.
So you hear a voice like that, and you're like, oh man, this is serious.
Yeah, and for me, I've always said when the issue of who do we think should narrate this film come up, I get asked that question. I say whoever's the best voice. To me, it's more important to have a good narrator than a name narrator who does a bad job, because we've had that. We had Destiny in Space was narrated by Leonard Nimoy, and if you go back and watch that film, it was not a very high quality narration.
Mitch, you want to weigh in? You're a resident Star Trek.
A lot of love for Leonard, but I can see it happening.
Yeah, very sleepy narration. You know,
some of them kind of make sense. I think Sam Neill for T-Rex is fun for people who grew up, and I always say Jurassic Park was like Top Gun for paleontology, and Sam Neill's Maverick. I mean, he's like the paleontologist that kids in the 90s grew up with. When they think of it, Bill Paxton did Tornado Alley, and people at that time associated him with Twister. So sometimes I think it matters and it makes sense. But I will tell you, to your point, sometimes you get a film and the narrator is a little sleepy, and it doesn't help pull you through it.
Right. And to me, the more important aspect of a film is the music.
That's true.
The music is what allows the feeling of the film to come through. I remember when the very first movie, going back to Blue Planet, they sent us the film, and back then it came in 15 different reels, and you had to splice it together. And so we spliced the film together. Jim Krall, our OMNIMAX chief projectionist, who's been here since 1990 also, he spliced it together, and then we would have to go look at it in the theater to make sure it was spliced in the proper order and that flowed correctly. And I hadn't seen the film before, but you could still kind of feel where it was, if it was not spliced together correctly, or it could have been spliced upside down or one section or whatever. So we went in the theater and looked at it, and we didn't have the music track yet. And I looked at it and said, this is awful. This is, the film just had no emotion. The film without the soundtrack has no emotion. The soundtrack, if you listen to the soundtrack, you still get emotion from music.
Yeah.
But the picture without the music is emotionless. And that's what I've always said, that people talk about the visual experience of the film, but I've always said that the soundtrack is 51% of the experience, and the film is 49%, because you get zero emotion out of just looking at the film.
A really great example of that is the Cuba film we had a few years ago. When you think of Cuba, if you can't eat the food, the music is probably the next or equally as evocative of Cuban culture.
Yep.
And that really drives that home. And to the point where when you see the Cuba film poster, you can hear the music in the back of your head even before you see the film. You know what that sounds like. And so if you go into that film and the music doesn't match, or someone does like a very orchestral score, it's not going to sync up, and it doesn't resonate.
Right.
But I can still so clearly remember that connection with the Cuba film because the music brought it all home.
Right, exactly. And there was also a great period of film production from the late 90s to the early 2000s where a couple producers were working with name musician talent. The Living Sea was a very popular film and had music by Sting. And it didn't just take his soundtracks. They got Sting into the studio and edited some of his songs to make them fit the movie. And they did the same thing with the Moody Blues on Journey into Amazing Caves, and that was a fantastic soundtrack. George Harrison did the same thing with the very popular Everest film.
Really?
So that was a thing back then. And then somehow they kind of flipped to spending the big bucks on music to spending the big bucks on the narration talent. And in my opinion, that was kind of probably not the best path to take, but that's where we are now. We're spending the extra money on the name for the narration.
We talked to Andy Wood, who was writer, director, producer of the T-Rex film, about how much some of the music cost, and what didn't make the cut based on the
Right.
music budget. And that was interesting. What is your favorite non-OmniMax space film?
You mean as in like a Hollywood
Yeah.
film?
I mean, you'd have grown up
Well,
with some really iconic ones. I mean,
Yes.
if you want to count E.T. in that vein, but
Yeah.
like the right stuff, 2001.
Well, obviously, all the sci-fi stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek.
yeah, Star Wars. The first Star Wars movie came out when I was in college. I remember going to see that in college.
Armageddon.
Yeah. So here's the thing about space films. This may sound weird to you, but I avoid Hollywood space films.
Do you?
Because they drive me nuts.
Because they get the physics wrong.
They get everything wrong.
Everything wrong.
You
Yeah.
can't. This fits you. Not being able to suspend disbelief.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, but the original Star Wars film would probably have to be it for me. I went back and looked at it, maybe 5-7 years ago when we did the Star Wars
Yeah.
costume exhibit. I
Yeah.
went back and looked at the entire series, and it's like so. The production values are so. They seemed great at the time, but now you look at them and they're like just not there.
But
For its time, it was revolutionary, right?
I will. We'll give the email at the end of the show, so you can yell at me for this, everyone. But the first 3 Star Wars that came out, you're right. When you look back at it, and the film technology and graphic technology we have today is so different. But then if you look at the 1999 when Phantom Menace came out and they did those 3, those hold up very poorly compared to the original, which there's a charm in that, the lower quality of it looking back at it. But also those films, they're not using real technology. They're just making up the story so they can bend the rules and do whatever, so that
Right.
that doesn't bother you.
The pure science fiction ones like Star Wars, that to me felt like pure science fiction. That was okay. I read a lot of science fiction when I was a kid,
Yeah.
so that seemed fine. But the more modern versions that try to link reality with some story into it, like Gravity or whatever, and those films I can't get myself to look at.
Your other major role here at Cincinnati Museum Center, exhibitions, featured exhibitions. So anytime you've come in, you've seen Cleopatra, you saw Pompeii, Dead Sea Scrolls, Bricktionary, on and on and on. Do you know how many featured exhibitions you've been involved in?
Well,
And when did you?
99 is when I kind of started
Okay.
doing that. The director of the museum at the time asked me to look at this project that our exhibit director, Sandy Shipley, who's also here for a long time, great director for the exhibit team, didn't have time to deal with. So he asked me to look at this exhibit, which was called Mysteries of Egypt. And it was a King Tut exhibit, but everything was recreation. But we decided to do it. That's the only exhibit we've ever done that didn't have any real artifacts, and it was all a recreated tomb. But we were not going to get the King Tut at the time. The King Tut's was only going to places like L.A. and Atlanta and Chicago and New York, and they wouldn't even consider coming to Cincinnati, and I'm not sure we could take the monetary risk at the time anyway, even if they wanted to. But so this was the first time I was asked to do that, and we had a very successful run in 1999 looking at that exhibit. And then the following year, another exhibit came along, Titanic. And this was all real artifacts from the Titanic. And again, I said, okay, Dave, you did the contract on the other one, do the contract on this one. So I was involved in working with that one. So it just kind of grew that I started being the person to sort of take over the special exhibit program. And we've had a lot of exhibits, obviously, since 1999. But these, what I call these special exhibits, there's a certain class of these exhibits in my mind that are so expensive for us to take on, they're risky for us to take on, that we have to sort of have a separate ticket for them. We have to, what we say, upcharge for them. And since the Egypt exhibit in 1999, that was the first of 26 of those that we've done. So
Really?
the number is 26 upcharge exhibits since then. And I've been involved in in finding and contracting all of those exhibits. And when Sandy left, I took on additional roles of overseeing the installation of the exhibits.
Do you have a favorite among those?
I have probably two favorites. And again, every exhibit project is totally different, and there's a backstory to almost every one. And some of the backstories are really interesting, and some of them are just crazy. But the two that stick out to me the most are two that I was able to actually participate in the selection of the artifacts. And the first one of those was the first Pompeii exhibit that we did 12 years ago.
2012.
Yeah.
I was selling audio guides for that one.
Yes.
I remember the opening film over and over and over.
Yes. So, it's a long story how we got involved in that, but our exhibition of that got delayed. There were 4 museums that got together to co-produce that exhibit, and we were one of those 4 museums. But we voluntarily left that group of 4 because we had this opportunity to do this bodies exhibit that we were waiting on, which is a whole nother story. So then a second group of 4 museums got together, and we were part of that second group. And for that group, as often happens with these artifacts from other countries, the artifacts have to go back to the institutions, to those countries every so often. Sometimes it's every year, sometimes it's every 2 years, sometimes it's every 3 years, depends on the rules of that country. In the case of Pompeii, it was 2 years, so they could do 4 6-month runs, and then the artifacts had to go back. So that first group of museums did their thing. The artifacts went back to Italy. Second group came in and they said, okay, do you want the same artifacts? Well, do we have a choice?
Yeah.
And they said, yes, come out and look. So the 4 museums went out to Pompeii, walked through Pompeii, went in their back storage rooms, looked at all the artifacts that were available, and were able to select artifacts for that exhibit. So that was like a unique experience.
So you got to you were there on the ground doing that.
Yeah,
okay.
I was in Pompeii doing that with the other museums. So that was really fun. And the other one that was like that was the Maya exhibit that we did fairly recently, which, in my opinion, is the most beautiful exhibit that we've ever hosted. But unfortunately, it was the least visited exhibit because of COVID. We literally had our opening party the night that the world shut down in March
13th, 2020.
Yep. And then the next day, the museum closed.
Yeah. So it never opened to the public. It was set to open to the public the next day. Never happened. And we didn't open until July of that year.
Yeah.
And we were able to get an extension on it, but still, people weren't coming out. And it was, in my opinion, the most beautiful exhibit, but also is one where I got to go to Guatemala. All the artifacts came from Guatemala, from 2 museums and a foundation in Guatemala. So I got to go to both of those museums and the foundation to help select the artifact set for that exhibit. So that was a unique experience also, going into the jungle to the Tikal Museum in Tikal, which is a long way from Guatemala City, where they had a lot of these spectacular artifacts that had never been out of Guatemala before. So that was very unique and rewarding.
I remember that exhibition. I remember March 12th sitting in a conference room with a whole mess of other people on my computer, and it would say, oh, hey, this museum says they're going to close in this city, and hey, this. And I had the press release open from Maya, and I would just keep backspacing, retyping a date, and then, oh, never mind. So I just remember the swirl of conversations, and I was drafting and redrafting press releases for what decision we were about to make.
Yeah.
And we had people from Guatemala flying in. We had people from Germany flying in, and and elsewhere in Europe flying in for this opening. I mean, they were already in town.
Yeah.
So it just a wild moment for that exhibition. Before we kick you out of here, there's one thing I wanna mention. You're a sneaky athlete. What sports did you play growing up? And have you always, is it just naturally athletic? The backstory on that, Davis hustled me multiple times in racquetball. I think the only times I consistently and successfully beat you. You had a wrist injury once.
With my right arm, so I had to play
So
left-handed.
I could beat Dave when he played left hand, barely, and it was not clean sweeps. Barely beat Dave when you played left-handed, and I think you had a knee issue or a knee injury once.
Yeah.
That I also took advantage of.
Yeah.
I've been on a broomball team with you,
Yeah.
where you've been a killer. I don't think we played softball together, but I know you were.
Yeah.
You were a mainstay on the softball team.
Yeah. So my high school had 3,000 people in it, and not to brag, but at one point in time, I was the 5th fastest person in my high school, because the gym teachers would have you run track and time you, and then they used that as a recruiting tool to figure out where do we want to put you in our athletic program, kind of thing. And they wanted me to go out for football. My parents said, no way. They wanted me to go out to track. I said, no way. That's boring. Even though my dad was a track star in college at Eastern Michigan University.
What events were they wanting you to do in track?
Sprints.
Yeah.
But which is very different from my dad, who was a long distance runner. I didn't want to do that. But I did play intramural football even going back to high school, and I was a wide receiver. And even though I have very small hands, I never dropped anything. And then in college...
That'd be the glove-free era too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Then in college, I played intramural football a bunch as a wide receiver.
And that's at Michigan State, which is a Big Ten school. It's a major school.
Yeah.
So every kid who was a great football star in their high school still didn't make the football team at Michigan State. So playing intramural, you're not playing against people who are just getting together on the weekend. You're still playing against really good talent.
Right. In fact, my team had a quarterback who was a star in high school, and the way the league worked at the time, and I think it's still the same at Michigan State, is you had unlimited forward passes. So you got 4 downs to go the length of the field. And if you didn't make it, you turned it over. But you could, on the reverse side, is you could pass as much as you want. You could catch a pass, then that person could pass it, whatever.
It's kind of like ultimate Frisbee rules.
Yes. But our team played traditional football rules, which screwed everybody up because they thought we were going to do all these little dinky passes here and there, right, to try to get to the end zone. But we had this super quarterback who was a star in high school who could throw the ball 50, 60 yards.
Yeah.
And we had a couple wide receivers that could just fly
Flat
down
out
the
run,
field.
yeah.
Yeah, so and he would throw the ball over the top of everybody, and we would catch the ball, and there was nobody to throw it to because we were past everybody at the time, so we just kept running. So we actually got to the not the finals, but we got deep into the playoffs one year doing that, and it was such unusual because everybody else was doing this dinky passing, and we were playing traditional football.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've always enjoyed sports. I was never good at tennis, although I tried that a lot. Racquetball was a little better. But that's another thing I did when I was in Richmond, Kentucky, at Eastern Kentucky University. I played a lot of racquetball as well as golf, so that's where I picked up racquetball.
But this is bullshit because I didn't know you were an astrophysicist then.
Yeah.
And so racquetball is all about angles, so you're just throwing physics around at me. I studied history. I could tell you where the ball was, but you were figuring out how to. I mean, that was when we played. I had to work twice as hard as you, and just to keep up, because you're always a smarter player, and I could like squeak some things out just to keep it close. I would not say I'm athletic, and I'm certainly not a finesse athlete. Like golf and bowling and tennis and things like that, where you need placement matters and touch matters and stuff like that. I've always been bad at that. So racquetball was like the perfect storm for me not to be successful.
Oh, you should have played tennis because I've never been able to figure out tennis. And
We used to do tennis in gym class in middle school, and the tennis courts were outside across from the parking lot where all the teachers parked. And you know, you've got these middle school kids with these soft wrists, because tennis, you really have to have some wrist control, because if you turn the plane of the racket just a little bit, it skews the trajectory. So I remember returning a serve, and I had my racket face open up, and I just skied this thing out of the tennis courts, and it hit the science teacher's car, who everyone was afraid of. And he lived down the street from me. And I didn't know this till I went to high school, so I was out of middle school. The nicest guy, but terrifying in middle school. And I hit his car with a tennis ball, and I was like, oh, God, that's the end of it for me. So, no, I should not have played tennis.
Okay.
All right, so before we wrap up, 2 questions I always ask. 1, if you had a walk-up song, what would it be?
A walk-up song.
And we know how important music is. And it sets the emotion for everything.
Yeah.
So choose wisely.
I can choose a group.
Track 2 from the OMNIMAX film.
No.
Journey into Amazing Days.
Boy, that's hard. That is so hard. But it'd probably be something from the Eagles.
You are an Eagles guy. I remember. Yes, yeah. Okay.
I have every Eagles song ever made on my playlist.
Do you?
On my phone, yeah.
And I don't know why you would, but if you could trade places with anyone in the museum for a day, who would you want to trade places with, and why?
Well, that's interesting because I have, in my career here, at some point in time, I've managed probably 2/3 of all the departments in the group. I was over finance for a brief period between CEOs. I was over the education department between VPs of education. I was over the visitor services department. So I
marketing,
events, yes,
exhibits,
events,
yes, that we've already talked about.
I've done all of it. So there's not too many places that I haven't at least tried.
You've done everything you want to do.
Yeah, I think so.
Speaking of overseeing so many departments, you did hire both Mitch and I.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Me and Mitch are both Dave Duszynski hires.
Yeah,
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, yes, there's a
are.
lot of them, and I'm proud of a lot of the hires. The most recent one was Amy Vastalisa, who you interviewed fairly recently, and we found her, and that was a great one. But when you've been around for 40 years now, since I started in '85 and never left, when you've been around for 40 years, you're going to end up hiring a lot of people.
Well, that's as good as any to end it on.
Yeah.
Dave, thank you. Thanks for sharing the Cincinnati Museum Center story with us.
Sure.
You've been with the organization longer than it's been at Union Terminal.
Yes.
Which is incredible. So thanks for joining us. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Remember, if you liked the show, please rate, review, and subscribe. And if you have any questions, send us an email at meanwhile@cincymuseum.org. And check out cincymuseum.org to see the latest reasons to visit. We'll catch you next time. Thanks.